Rome in the year 39 felt like a giant trying to steady its breath. From the top of the Palatine hill, the imperial palace rested under the glow of hundreds of oil lamps. Looking calm from the outside, but carrying a quiet tension inside its walls. Music drifted through open windows, perfumes hung in the air, and forced laughter bounced between columns of shining marble. Senators walked in proudly with their finest robes, their wives beside them like carved statues meant to complete the picture of elegance. The whole scene looked perfect, almost too perfect, as if beauty could hide the trembling underneath. Rome was celebrating, yes, but its heart beat with fear. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it in the air. Something was wrong. Something was waiting to happen. And when the emperor finally stepped forward that night, the world of every person in that hall changed forever. If you're watching the History Sage, stay with this story until the end because the nights you're about to hear were so shocking that Rome itself tried to bury them. Like, share, and comment where you're watching from as we step into a world where one man's desires were stronger than the laws of an entire empire. The banquet moves slowly through whispered conversations and the soft clinking of silver cups. Then silence fell so suddenly it felt physical, like a stone dropping through the room. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Caligula Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus walked in without hurry, his face unreadable. His eyes drifted over the crowd the way someone studies pieces on a game board. Then he lifted his hand and pointed at a senator's wife. "She is mine tonight," he said. It was not a request. It was a command sealed by absolute power. No one breathed. The senator didn't move. His wife didn't blink. Everyone in that room knew the truth. In Rome, when the man who holds total authority speaks, the law bends and morality shatters. Refusing him was not disrespect. It was rebellion, a crime that could erase an entire family from history. So while music continued downstairs, pretending everything was normal, the first crack of the night tore through the palace. Decades later, pieces of letters found in old Vatican archives revealed that many senators begged their relatives never to bring their wives or daughters to Rome. Men who commanded armies and shaped laws realized their power meant nothing beside one man's will. Caligula was not simply unpredictable, as legends later claimed. Ancient writings make it clear that he understood exactly what he was doing. He knew how to blur the lines between what was allowed and what was forbidden. For 4 years, the empire became his experiment. He pushed society inch by inch to see how much pressure it could take before it collapsed. And the worst part was that none of it was hidden. Rome knew something dark was growing in the palace, but no one dared name it. Because when a ruler proves that no divine rule or human limit can restrain him, a city stops being a community. It becomes a stage where fear directs every movement. To understand the kind of fear that ruled Rome during those years, you only need to imagine what happened after each imperial banquet. Senators returned home in silence, unable to look their wives or daughters in the eyes, carrying a heaviness that clung to them like a shadow. Whatever happened behind the palace doors could not be spoken aloud. It could not even be whispered. In an empire where all power rested in one man, even words became dangerous. A comment made to the wrong person could be seen as defiance, and defiance could wipe out an entire family line. This was the true world Caligula created. It wasn't built from marble or gold. It was built from silence, thick, heavy, and carefully shaped into a weapon. In 1962, a discovery in the Vatican archives revealed how deep that silence ran. Several letters written by senators to relatives far from Rome warned that the capital was no longer a safe place for women. These letters rarely described anything directly. They used metaphors, hints, and even prayers to avoid writing anything that could be read as criticism. "Do not bring your daughters to the city," one senator begged. "Here, honor no longer belongs to the gods. It belongs to one man." This censorship didn't come from official orders. It came from fear itself. Every sentence was measured as though the parchment could betray the writer. And this kind of society was not unique to Rome. Modern historians call it the architecture of fear, a pattern seen throughout the ancient world. The details change, but the core stays the same. When punishment depends not on laws, but on a ruler's mood, citizens stop acting like citizens. They become a crowd that only wants to survive. The Romans, proud heirs of the old republic, now lived in a distorted version of their own political system. Authority no longer came from virtue or tradition. It came from unpredictability. And Caligula knew exactly how this worked. He was not the chaotic figure later stories make him seem. According to many ancient texts, he studied how obedience truly formed not through explicit threats, but through uncertainty. Every move he made reminded the people that their routines, their peace, even their identities could be broken without warning. Power like that doesn't need to shout. It seeps into people's thoughts. Soon citizens measured every glance, every breath, every pause before speaking. Even temples, places meant to comfort the spirit, became places of anxiety. Priests feared interpreting signs in the sky in ways that might seem like criticism. Religious ceremonies shifted to reflect this fear. Prayers asked less for justice and more for survival. Rome, the city that once prided itself on its ability to challenge tyrants, now lived under the weight of one man's whims. And while the markets kept buzzing and travelers kept arriving, something deeper was dying. The idea of community began to crumble inside people's minds. The law no longer protected. It simply watched. In that vacuum, Caligula found fertile ground for the next stage of his rule, turning the private lives of Rome's noble families into a ritual of control. As silence settled deeper over Rome, the imperial palace slowly changed into a stage where privacy no longer existed. Caligula, fully aware of the power he held over the city's most respected families, invented a system that mixed ceremony, social pressure, and a dark political message. He designed a hidden space inside the palace, behind long corridors and heavy curtains, where family bonds were tested in ways no one dared to describe openly. The invitations sent to senatorial families looked innocent at first glance. They promised a celebration, a grand feast, an evening to honor Rome. But everyone who received them knew those words were only a mask. When guests arrived, the truth became clear. Men were led into dimly lit rooms watched by silent guards. Men who didn't need to speak to make it obvious no one could leave. Women were taken elsewhere, Into chambers where a so-called consecration ritual took place, a phrase ancient writers used to hide acts they could never write directly. What happened in those rooms was never described in detail, but the empty stares of the women who walked out at dawn said more than any document ever could. In 1978, a letter discovered in Florence revealed the despair of Lucius Vitellius, a senator whose young wife was forced to undergo one of these rituals. "I prayed to lose my hearing," he wrote. He didn't ask for his wife to be saved or for the ritual to stop. He begged not to hear it. Those few words captured the heart of Caligula's rule. The truth was so unbearable that witnesses preferred to break parts of themselves rather than face it fully. When Vitellius's wife returned at sunrise, the silence between them was so deep it felt colder than the marble halls they had just left. Rome could continue its festivals and feasts, but something inside both of them had been carved out with unsettling precision. Even more disturbing was a wax tablet preserved in the British Museum. It listed the names of noble women and recorded the amount of money they supposedly generated. During these events, it was not real accounting. It was a cruel imitation of trade, a symbolic way of turning dignity and honor into simple numbers. The message behind it was brutal and unmistakable. If Caligula could treat the empire's most respected women as items in a mock marketplace, he could treat the Senate itself as nothing more than props in his performance of power. This system wasn't designed for scandal. It was designed for erosion. When a ruler forces the mightiest men of a nation to stand frozen, while their homes and families are torn apart, he builds more than fear. He builds a culture where humiliation becomes normal. In such a world, rebellion doesn't disappear because it is impossible. It disappears because it becomes unthinkable. Rome didn't realize it yet, but it had already begun losing its soul long before losing its freedom. And Caligula, watching every carefully contained reaction, understood that if he could break the very idea of dignity, he could go even further. His next step would be something far more audacious, reshaping the line between humanity and the divine, and forcing an entire empire to witness the transformation. After breaking the spirit of Rome's noble families with rituals that shattered their sense of safety, Caligula turned towards something even more dangerous: the boundary between human and divine. Rome had always separated the world of mortals from the world of gods. That line gave order to their beliefs and shaped their identity as a people. But in times of political chaos, the line could blur. Caligula understood this perfectly, and he began reshaping his public image not as a leader sent by the gods, but as a divine figure walking among men. The emperor had three sisters: Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla. Ancient writings, wrapped in careful wording, reveal that Caligula used his closeness with them as a symbolic tool. It was not just scandal, it was a message. At official banquets, Drusilla, his favorite, didn't sit as a guest. She sat as though she were his partner in ceremony, openly sharing the emperor's couch in full view of the highest officials of the empire. It was not done in secret. It was shown deliberately, like a ritual meant to challenge the very foundation of Roman morality. And no one dared question it. To the Romans, this was shocking, almost unthinkable. But Caligula had a silent argument behind it. In the myths of Olympus, the gods did not follow human rules. Zeus and Hera were siblings and spouses. Divine bloodlines stayed closed to preserve power. By repeating these gestures, Caligula was sending a deeper message than any written law could express. He wasn't simply a man chosen by the gods. He was a god commanding the mortal world. The senators who were forced to witness these scenes understood the danger. A ruler who claims to be human can be judged. A ruler who claims to be divine cannot be touched by any earthly justice. Obedience becomes more than political. It becomes spiritual. And when obedience reaches that level, freedom dissolves like wax under fire. When Drusilla died in the year 38, likely from an illness, Rome expected the emperor to mourn her. Instead, he did something even more disturbing. Caligula declared her a goddess. He ordered temples built in her honor, demanded offerings made in her name, and commanded the public to worship her as a new star in Rome's sky. At night, according to Senate records, he visited these temples alone and performed ceremonies that resembled ancient marriage rituals, but directed toward Drusilla's statue. For him, death was not a separation. It was a new stage in the bond he had created. A Roman philosopher, whose name was erased from the manuscript to protect him, wrote, "The emperor steps away from the path of mortals. He confuses stone with flesh and forces us to share his vision." That single sentence captured the atmosphere of the time. The empire now lived inside the mind of a man who believed he had risen above time, gods, and human limits. The palace became a place where every gesture was calculated. Senators laughed when he laughed. They clapped when he ordered it. They turned their eyes away only when he allowed it. Women returned to their homes drained and silent. The weight of the palace rituals carried inside them like something that could not be named. And while everyone pretended life was normal, Rome learned a painful truth. When a ruler destroys the line between the sacred and the human, he also destroys the protections that keep a society whole. Caligula's next step would be even more extreme. After reshaping the divine, he would turn human suffering into a carefully designed performance. Drusilla's death in the year 38 marked a turning point that cut deeply into Caligula's mind. For Rome, her passing was unsettling. For the emperor, it was like losing the last thread keeping him connected to human emotion. Drusilla was not just his sister. According to ancient accounts, she was the only person who could calm the fears he carried since childhood, the betrayals, the losses, the years spent living as a political hostage among generals who might turn on him at any moment. When she died, Caligula didn't just lose a loved one. He lost the only anchor he had left. The people expected a traditional mourning period, something solemn and respectful. But Caligula's reaction went far beyond anything Rome could understand. He declared Drusilla a goddess not as an honorary gesture, but as a real, living presence within his world. He ordered temples built for her. He commanded priests to speak her name in rituals. Citizens were forced to worship her through offerings, songs, and ceremonies. Anyone who hesitated, even slightly, was viewed with suspicion. Historical records say Caligula often visited these temples alone at night. He didn't arrive with guards or large processions. He walked in quietly, as though entering a private conversation. Writers describe these nighttime ceremonies only in poetic hints, avoiding explicit detail. A philosopher, whose name was later removed from his own writings, said the emperor sought to embrace marble as though it were living flesh, and demands that the empire accept the same illusion. Those words captured the emotional emptiness that had begun consuming Caligula. But there was more behind these acts than grief. There was strategy. Turning Drusilla into a goddess allowed Caligula to build his own personal cult, a spiritual mechanism to control Rome. If the people accepted Drusilla as divine, they would also accept that the connection between him and her was holy. And if their bond was holy, Caligula was no longer only a ruler. He became the link between the human world and eternity. That shift freed him from all earthly limits. The effects spread quickly. Young women in Rome were suddenly compared to the idealized images of Drusilla. Their families felt silent pressure to match her supposed perfection. Priests, unable to oppose the emperor, adjusted their interpretations of omens to support the rise of a new deity. Sculptors were ordered to make statues of Drusilla with smooth, perfected features, removing any sign of humanity. Rome's memory began to reshape itself, little by little. Psychologically, Caligula seemed trapped in his own contradiction. The more divine he made Drusilla, the more isolated he became. His worship of his dead sister was not a farewell. It was his way of refusing to let her go. Death, to him, was not separation. It was transformation. Meanwhile, the people of Rome watched in silence. They didn't speak, not because they agreed, but because fear had become stronger than outrage. When the grief of a ruler becomes a law, the entire city becomes a prisoner of his emotions. And yet the story had not reached its darkest point. Once Caligula reshaped Drusilla into a divine icon, he turned his eyes toward another battlefield, the idea of public virtue. This part of Roman life was sacred, displayed proudly in every noble household, and Caligula would twist it into a spectacle designed to break even the strongest hearts in the empire. After reshaping the boundary between humanity and divinity, Caligula shifted his attention towards something even more fragile: virtue. In Rome, virtue was not just a moral idea. It was the foundation of political alliances, marriages, inheritance, and public reputation. To attack a woman's honor was to strike at the very core of her family's identity. Caligula understood this perfectly, and according to fragments found near Pompeii in 1951, he designed private ceremonies during imperial banquets with a single purpose: not to cause immediate scandal, but to break people emotionally. He chose women whose reputations were spotless, wives known across Rome for dignity and loyalty. He did not target those already surrounded by gossip. He targeted those who seemed untouchable. That was the point. Destroying something delicate doesn't create fear. Destroying something believed to be unbreakable does. These ceremonies never involved Rome's celebrated gladiators or famous veterans. Instead, Caligula ordered guards to bring men straight from the arena, exhausted, dusty, still carrying the smell of blood and iron. They were not heroes. They were survivors. The psychological effect was deliberate. Placing these brutal, Worn fighters next to noble women created a moral dissonance that cracked people from the inside. The banquets continued as usual soft music, forced laughter, wine flowing into silver cups until Caligula gave a quiet order. A woman was escorted to the center of the hall. Her husband watched helplessly, fists clenched under the table. The entire court held its breath. Caligula smiled a small, cold expression and spoke to words repeated in more than one surviving manuscript. Let her entertain. Ancient writers avoided describing what happened next. Instead, they used metaphors and coded language. One senator wrote of an eclipse at midday. Another described a ceremony that turned honor into shadow. They were skilled historians, but even they knew some truths were safer hinted at than recorded. Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the same man who later attempted to overthrow the emperor, left a testimony that survived centuries. "I watched my wife collapse in spirit before my eyes," he wrote. "If I protested, my children would die. So I smiled, I applauded, and every day a part of me disappeared." His letter was intercepted. Piso was executed. His family lost everything. The document was kept as a warning, not as a record of justice. But behind the terror was a deeper purpose. Caligula was not merely punishing individuals. He was attacking symbols, virtue, purity, marital honor. He turned these ideals into props in his theater of power. When a society accepts that its most sacred values can be twisted into entertainment, it loses the ability to tell the difference between moral truth and the desires of its ruler. Rome kept hosting lavish feasts, but its moral foundation was collapsing quietly, like a temple whose stones are being removed one by one from underneath. And Caligula wasn't done yet. After humiliating noble women and corrupting the idea of virtue, he aimed for an even bolder target: the identity of Rome's most powerful men. After tearing apart the dignity of noble families and turning virtue into a stage performance, Caligula aimed at something even more personal: the identity of Rome's most powerful men. In Rome, a man's authority was tied to honor, family leadership, and his public image. But Caligula understood something few tyrants have ever used so precisely. To destroy a man, you don't need to kill him. You only need to shatter the role that gives him meaning. Accounts from Suetonius and fragments found in Alexandria in 1989 show that Caligula pushed this idea further than anyone imagined. He created marriage rituals where he played the role of the groom, while respected senators or generals were forced to play the symbolic part of the bride. These events were not jokes. They were formal ceremonies with veils, legal formulas, invented dowries, and witnesses who had no choice but to applaud. One of the most mentioned victims was Lucius Vitellius, a man known for his political strength. A surviving fragment of a marriage contract lists Caligula as husband and Vitellius as wife. The message was unmistakable. If the emperor could rewrite the role of a Roman man, he could rewrite anything. The emotional destruction was enormous. Vitellius, once honored in the Forum, was forced to appear before thousands wearing wedding garments and a bridal veil, acting out a role that contradicted everything Roman society valued. It was not a private humiliation. It was a public rewriting of identity. and every man watching knew the next ceremony could be theirs. In a culture where marriage represented order and stability, turning it into a tool of domination meant the emperor was dismantling the very structure that held society together. Soon senators walked through Rome like ghosts. They feared losing not only their influence, but the image they had built through decades of service. Any dream of opposing Caligula faded. How could anyone fight a ruler who didn't just break laws, but rewrote ancient customs for his amusement? By stripping powerful men of their public identity, Caligula removed the Senate's final defense. Obedience was no longer enough. Now men had to accept distorted versions of themselves, shaped entirely by his will. These ceremonies became silent warnings. Whenever Caligula walked through the palace gardens, the strongest men in Rome lowered their eyes, terrified he might choose them next. If he could transform a respected leader into a symbolic bride, he could turn anyone into anything he imagined. Rome's moral structure was cracking. What followed would not be a single moment of disgrace, but a slow emotional collapse spreading through the empire. As rituals in the palace grew more frequent and unpredictable, Rome began to feel like a body struggling to breathe. The forum remained busy, markets opened daily, temples filled with incense, but beneath this normal surface was a deep moral decay the people could barely describe. The empire entered a phase where fear wasn't an emotion. It was the foundation holding everything together. Documents from the year 40 reveal a Senate trapped in empty motions. They passed laws no one believed, approved proposals out of terror, and praised the emperor in speeches whose insincerity echoed through the palace. Rome, once a symbol of debate and discipline, became a silent machine, unable to correct its own decline. Caligula, sensing this collapse, grew even more unpredictable. Some sources claim he ordered massive building projects, channels, temples, enormous statues not out of need, but to prove the empire existed to satisfy his whims. At other times, he gave out absurd amounts of money only to take it back days later. His message never changed. Nothing in Rome was stable except his will. The economy weakened under the weight of his spending. Prices rose. Soldiers whispered in their camps. Ordinary people who once found comfort in daily routines realized that even normal life was slipping away. This was not a dramatic crisis. It was a slow, quiet breaking of the empire's emotional core. Priests recorded that the gods seemed silent during Caligula's ceremonies. Omens became confused, and rituals meant to protect Rome were rewritten to support whatever the emperor desired. Religion, once a place of balance and meaning, became another tool in his hands. Meanwhile, whispers began to rise among the aristocrats. They were not brave speeches or calls for justice. They were exhausted voices saying, "Rome cannot survive like this. The body is sick. If the poison stays, we will all die." The push against Caligula did not come from courage. It came from fatigue. People no longer dreamed of restoring the Republic or reviving old virtues. They simply wanted to breathe again. The military grew restless. Senators walked like shadows. Noble families, humiliated over and over, no longer cared about honor-only survival. Rome was living beside its emperor, not with him. The empire breathed despite him, not because of him. The end approached quietly, like a whisper through the palace corridors. Something had to break when Caligula finally fell. The morning after his death carried not triumph, but a strange mix of relief and shame. Rome awakened as though rising from a nightmare, asking itself how one man managed to reshape its spirit into something so unrecognizable. The streets that had been silenced by fear now murmured cautiously, as if the city had forgotten how to speak. This was not just a political change, it was an emotional repair. After 4 years ruled by a man who twisted the sacred, the intimate, and the human, Rome had to rebuild more than its institutions. It had to rebuild its soul. Philosophers of the time wrote that a ruler without self-control is like a ship without a rudder. Seneca later wrote that a man who believes he is a god without first learning how to be human becomes a slave to his own desires. That was Caligula's fate. He didn't just misuse power. He emptied power of its purpose. Authority, meant to protect and unite, became a mirror for his fears and obsessions. Historical records show that after his death, many senators confessed something heartbreaking. The worst part wasn't surviving the humiliations. It was getting used to them. That was the tragedy. A society can adapt even to what destroys it, as long as the fear is constant. But Rome learned something essential: resilience. Over time, the Senate regained part of its voice. Families began to rebuild their honor. The empire continued under a new emperor. Life moved forward. But the echo of Caligula's rule stayed for centuries as a warning. The greatest danger is not a cruel leader. It is a leader without limits. Cruelty hurts bodies. Unlimited power destroys worlds. For those of us looking back now, Caligula's story is a mirror. It forces us to ask, what happens when leadership stops being a duty and becomes a stage for one person's desires? It's a question that matters in every era. The tragedy of Rome was not only the fall of an emperor, it was the moment when the city lost its collective conscience. But from that darkness came a message strong enough to last through ages. Power needs boundaries, just as fire needs a container. Without them, the light that guides can turn into the fire that consumes. History does not exist to punish. It exists to remind. And in Caligula's case, it reminds us that even the greatest empire in the world can fall into shadow if it allows one man's darkness to become everyone's fate.